Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
I'm Nancy.
And you may recognize Nancy's voice from past episodes. For example, ones on neural oscillations and social neuroscience research. And she is back with us again. So this is a slightly non-average episode. We don't have a scientific topic that we're talking about. We didn't read anything to prepare for it, but we're kind of going to talk more about the process of doing science and our experiences as scientists, particularly around the topic of kind of how we choose how to consume science. You know, when you're in a field, it's important that you keep up with the literature and you know what other research is being done, but there's a lot of that. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of decide how you keep up with that. And in particular, we're kind of interested with the idea of what happens when scientists take in information from a little bit beyond what they're used to, learning about things outside of their own research area. And this kind of stemmed from, basically, we decided that we wanted to try to do something at Cosyne, which is a conference that brings together computational and experimental neuroscientists. And we kind of wanted to ask people something at Cosyne. We wanted to interview the attendees at Cosyne. And I guess Josh and Connor and I had an email exchange about what we should ask people. And at first we were going to focus on the experimental theory divide that happens there, maybe try to get people, you know, if you're an experimentalist, to talk about something that interests you in theory or some questions that you would have for theorists and vice versa. But then I guess we didn't want to be so like divisive or
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of strange cultural divide where, and I think this is true in many different fields, not just neuroscience, and in many different sort of related kinds of contexts where like there are people whose skill set and focus is more towards collecting data, and there are people who have more of a background in like physics and math and statistics, who have skills that are less along the lines of gathering data and more for analyzing data and sort of doing things with computers to build models.
And frequently those people might have done very different undergraduate degrees.
Or even PhDs if they came to neuroscience later. And so I guess there are, you know, maybe like there are like stereotypes that each group has about the other group. I mean, you would say this is true, Nancy, right? Like,
yeah, I guess I remember in grad school thinking that for sure there were more men in the theory side of this divide, experimental and theorists.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And also, I agree with you that they tend to come from more math backgrounds, and a lot of people from physics that get interested in the brain. And it is true that if you're on the experimentalist side, you're more likely coming from biology or a neuroscience undergrad degree, like what Grace alluded to. I'm not sure what stereotypes you were thinking.
No, I mean, yeah, I just also like that maybe people have different feelings about it. Different people are more or less inclined to collaborate across these kinds of groups. Like some people who collect data don't really like sharing their data with theory computational people. Sometimes there are theory computational people who do not really stay very close to data. So like people on both sides have like sort of how much are they interested in collaborating with people across the divide?
Yeah, and how much value do they think certain people bring to neuroscience as a whole? Yeah, there are. I mean, so it's the people who go to Cosyne. So this is it's an acronym for Computational and Systems Neuroscience, and so this is a crowd that obviously enjoys the connection between experiment and theory. So there wouldn't be like the extremes, you know, like experimentalists who think that like computational people are garbage or anything like that. They're not going to go to Cosyne.
Yeah, I do agree that there's definitely like you know, you can fit data, you can make a model do anything. That I've heard those comments for sure. It's like
Yeah.
The model is gonna do what you tell it to do. So I forgot what type of background the person had, but I remember it was a senior person saying this. So I've heard that. I've definitely heard that. But I think likely like people, at least the circles of people I've been with, there's no downside of collaborating and giving your data. As long as it's not that because it seems like from the same data you could have two papers with, one is the experimental perspective, so it's like, what are you losing? You're not really losing anything.
Yes, there are many practical reasons to collaborate in addition to, I was going to say spiritual, but like pure scientific reasons for collaboration.
That's true.
But so ultimately, we decided to not kind of foster these divisions or force people to, proclaim that they're on one side and try to speak to the other side or anything like that. So the way that we framed the question was just tell us about a finding or a method that is outside of your own immediate research area that you think is exciting. So that allowed people to self-define what their research area was and how far outside of it counted as outside. And so it didn't force people into any categories, which was good. In collecting these interviews, it wasn't like super easy to get a lot of people to participate. I think part of that is just because people aren't like super eager to have themselves recorded by a random girl who walks up to them at a conference and asks if they want to be on a podcast. So, but also I think people kind of, it's a hard question to ask because it's almost like asking like a negative, like tell me something that's not what you do. And so it's hard for people to search in their mind, for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to try to get people to do that. And there were a lot of people who said like, well, let me think on it and I'll get back to you. And then they did, and they had really good answers and stuff. But I think there's something interesting about that, the idea that trying to think of what is cool that is happening outside of your own immediate research area is challenging at times because you don't store that information as much. Even at a conference like Cosyne, which is a small conference and everyone's in the same room together for the talks and stuff, you're seeing a lot of information that is outside of your own field. But what you do with that information can vary dramatically. Like I know when I listen to talks, sometimes I'm like really actively like thinking, oh, how does this relate to my work? Or how does this relate to this other idea that I've been thinking about? And then other times I'm just kind of like letting it wash over me. And if something really interesting sticks out, then maybe like I'll lodge that in my memory. But other times, it just happens and then it's gone.
Yeah, most of the time I try to think about how the talk relates to my work. And it also depends on whatever stage you are. Like I remember when I was finishing my PhD and thinking of what to do next, I was purposely like really stepping out of my comfort zone and reading a lot of relatively random things to see what caught my attention. But right now that I'm 1 year and a little bit over a year into my postdoc, I'm just trying to focus. So it's like if a seminar is not exactly on something very relevant, I might not go. It's like, no, I have to be like collecting data. So it's shifting, it depends in the stage that I am in, how I utilize the information that's not relevant.
Yeah. And I think, so in the interviews, we have some from PhD students and postdocs and professors. And I don't know, it could be interesting to think about how maybe different stages of career means that, people have different, it's possible to me that as a professor, you have the kind of most room to really look beyond what you do, especially if you're tenured, you can be kind of making reaches.
For sure, yeah.
And you can, like look for an idea and then kind of request that a student or postdoc of yours goes more in depth, and then they're going to be focused on that one small area, but you can be looking broadly. So I guess right now we will play those interviews. There's 11 interviews and they're a couple minutes each to let people know about the kinds of ideas that people have been talking about in these interviews. And so basically what it is each person that I interviewed, I just asked them to give their name and describe their position in their own work briefly, and then give a description of something that they found interesting beyond their own work. And a lot of people chose to reference stuff that they had seen at Cosyne, which obviously makes a lot of sense, but that wasn't a requirement. So some people are just bringing up random other things that they've seen that they think are cool. So we will listen to those. And they have a nice little conference murmur in the background that I kind of like, really authenticates it, proves that I was there.
It's an aesthetically pleasing background sound.
Yeah. So enjoy.
Hi, my name is Jan Sweeney. I'm a postdoc in Claudia Klopath's group. I study synaptic plasticity in neural networks. And what I think is cool is the sort of transition from very constrained tasks in like lab environments towards like looking at actual natural animal behavior. It looks like social neuroscience is kind of becoming cool, and I think basically letting rats and bats and all these kind of things just fly around as we track them and look at what they do can tell us loads about actual behavior, and I'm looking forward to it.
So I'm Braden Brinkman, a new assistant professor at Stony Brook University in New York on Long Island. So my research kind of covers efficient coding in sensory systems and collective behavior of neural networks, and trying to figure out how the network structure gets translated into function. One of the things I thought was really interesting, and what I want to think about a little bit more, is a point that got brought up in Ian Cousin's lecture last night, where he was talking about how in social organisms you might be able to offload computation from the individual's nervous systems to some sort of social computation, and I was kind of interested in thinking about how the sort of evolutionary aspect of social behavior might put constraints or ease constraints on neural architecture, so that the actual neural circuits, you might be able to get away with them being a little bit simpler, in order, and then having that sort of computation done at a social population level. And one of the reasons I think that is interesting is that I think a cool place for neuroscience to go, computational neuroscience to go, would be trying to think about evolution of networks and coding strategies. Like, for example, in the efficient coding literature, we're always trying to find some optimal coding strategy, and a frequent criticism that gets brought up is like, well, what if an organism doesn't need to be optimal, it just needs to be good enough? And so I've always wanted to think a little bit about, well, could we actually develop a model, an evolutionary model for like a sensory circuit, and look at the distribution of coding strategies that come out, instead of trying to hone in on the optimal coding strategy, scare quotes that you can't see because this is an audio recording. And so I think the connection that Ian Cousin brought up with thinking about how social dynamics might influence neural architecture sort of in a similar vein, and something that I thought was really cool and want to sit and think about a little bit more.
I'm Ben Lansdell. I'm a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. I work with Conrad Quoting, and so I'm interested in causal inference and reinforcement learning, and how those two things can kind of benefit from interacting. And at this conference, I'm also interested in models of hippocampal replay. So it can be used for planning. So it's like, if you navigate a maze, you might see kind of activations at some later point that kind of mimic traversing that maze. And so there's evidence that can be used for kind of planning.
So my name is Adrian Redyellow. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Houston. And so I am in the math department. And so right now I'm studying mathematical models for decision-making in changing environments, and especially applied to rats. A topic that's a bit outside of what I'm doing, but that really interested me today was the new software called SecNMF that was presented by one of the speakers today. And so it's a software, apparently, it's an algorithm that allows to find sequences, find hidden patterns in neural activity. So if you're given a large amount of trials with the activity of the neuron over each trial, I mean, I didn't understand everything in the talk, but apparently the software allows you to unscramble data that seems to be scrambled at first sight. So I think it's impressive that we can use machines to do this type of work. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Hi there. This is Johanna Soldado Magraner. I work at the Gatsby unit, UCL, and I'm a theoretical neuroscientist, and I work with electrophysiological data from monkeys that are trying to perform decision-making tasks. And I have to say, I was really surprised by one of the keynote invited talks given by Professor Cosyne. That's at Constance in a Max Planck Institute for, I think, ornithology. That was quite fascinating. It was like quite a new and fresh thing to see at Cosyne, because it's not really directly related to the work that I think any of us doing here. So yeah, modeling complex systems in general is like I find it really fascinating, because probably they use probably very similar tools that we use, but the subject of study is also behavior, but in a very different setting from what we are used to model. So it's not focusing on the individual, but focusing on like collective individuals. So I think that was really cool, really like out of the box.
Hi. So I'm Zack Kilpatrick. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Mathematics at University of Colorado Boulder. My research focuses on working memory, decision making, spatiotemporal dynamics of large-scale neural systems. And I'm interested in methods for analyzing stochastic processes in neuroscience. And recently, I've gotten interested in collective behavior of groups of organisms. So how organisms make decisions of where to move, where to forage, and how to self-organize. And one of my collaborators, Orit Peleg at the University of Colorado, has been working on some projects on honeybees. So honeybees form swarms, and they form tighter swarms when it's cold in order to maintain high temperature. And one of the studies that she has been doing looked at the effect of mechanical forcing on honeybees in swarms. So if you shake the swarm back and forth, the swarm will flatten itself out against the branch that it's on. And by studying the mechanical modes of the honeybee swarm, they were able to find that what this does for the honeybees is to reduce the pendular motion and sort of the pendular forces applied to the honeybee swarm. So I think this is fascinating because you have the individual behavior of honeybees is locally sensing the forces in the environment, and the result is that the swarm as a whole solves a problem of becoming more stable. So that's a really cool finding. Thanks for your time.
Hi, my name is Bill Pulaski, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford. And my main research interest is in network dynamics. One area of research in neuroscience that I think is very exciting these days is in developing new technologies to record from many neurons in the cortex and other brain areas. Researchers at UCL and other institutions have recently developed this new probe called NeuroPixel, which has 1,000 recording sites and can record from many thousands of neurons at the same time, which is probably around an order of magnitude more than the current state of the art. This is really exciting because the more neurons we can record from, the better idea that we have of what individual neural circuits are doing and how they interact with other brain areas, which is really cool.
Hi, I'm Carson Stringer. I'm a postdoc at Janelia Research Campus, and Cosyne has been fun this year. I saw a cool poster about hunger modulation in cortex, and specifically in higher order visual areas, there's hunger-dependent cells, and I thought that was pretty sweet.
Hey, I'm Julia Shartov. I'm a PhD student at Boston University, and I work with Nancy Padilla. And my thesis work is on understanding the mechanisms that bridge cellular properties with network behavior, specifically looking at fast-spiking interneurons in the striatum and modeling their generation of oscillations. So the question was something that's not related to my research, right? But I saw it at Cosyne. It was really cool. Okay, so I would say probably Ann Kennedy's work on representation of sex in the hypothalamus was really interesting to me, just because the study of sexual behavior is something that's really interesting and does not interact with the computational neuroscience world that much. And it's something that is of massive public interest, especially if you can get experiments that can demonstrate in humans the similar things that you're finding in animals. I think it would answer a lot of questions that people have about the nature of our understanding of human sex and human sexual biology. So I thought that was really cool.
Hi, I'm Adam Calhoun. I'm a postdoc at Princeton University, and I work on natural behaviors and courtship and statistical methods to analyze behavior. So one talk that I saw at Cosyne that I thought was really interesting was by Tiago Branco. He's investigating escape behaviors in mice, and he found two sets of neurons, or two anatomical regions in the brain, where the first region integrates evidence about how nervous the animal is or how willing it is to escape. And there's this really interesting recurrent population code that allows the animal to slowly accumulate information. And this information is thresholded at the next synapse that allows the animal to make this escape or not escape decision. And there's this really nice dissection of a somewhat complicated and very natural behavior. And I found that very beautiful.
Kristen DeLaet, postdoc in Linda Wilbrecht's lab at UC Berkeley, and my research is on circuit mechanisms of reward-based learning in mice. And the research that I was really interested in was this paper that was looking at conditioned hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, in human populations that either had experienced daily auditory hallucinations or didn't have any experience of hallucinations, even though they could be psychotic. So I thought the task was really cool, because what they did is they paired a visual stimulus with a 1 kilohertz tone that came after it, and they paired it with varying intensities of the sound. So they figured out the psychometric curves for each person, and so they found what that kind of detection threshold was. And so pairing it consistently with this just detectable sound, they could then go below threshold or not play the tone at all, and people would experience, even normal healthy people would experience these conditioned auditory hallucinations. But they did find that people who actually experienced auditory hallucinations in their daily life were much more susceptible to this influence. And it was interesting that they then applied this model to kind of capture their auditory processing. And they found that people who had hallucinations much more strongly weighted the prior expectation based on the visual cue to determine whether they detected something. And I thought it was cool because they had this population of people who lived with these voices. Maybe they thought they communicated with ghosts, or they were mediums or whatever, but they found the same influence of the model and similar neural signatures. So that was also cool, that people who were having these hallucinations, the activation in the auditory cortex looked almost identical to when they had the tone played. So I just thought it was really interesting probing this kind of really abstract, personal, experiential sort of thing in a controlled manner.
Okay, so that's what people at Cosyne had to say. Do we have any immediate reactions?
Well, it's interesting that I wasn't at Cosyne, so I don't know how good his talk was, or if it was like a main presidential quote unquote lecture. Ian Cuisine's talk, a lot of people mentioned that work being inspiring.
So yeah, I saw that talk, and it was a really nice talk. He does this research on collective behavior of groups of animals, and it was pretty cool because obviously people in the neuroscience community are interested in animal behavior. You know, a lot of people are trying to explain the behavior of animals via the brain. But then the especially cool thing was that the way they analyze, like a bunch of different birds or fish or something, is kind of similar to the way that we analyze a bunch of neurons acting together. So it was like working on two levels. And definitely a lot of people were talking about that talk after the fact. Also, he's just like a really good communicator. So if you give a good talk and make it interesting and have cool videos and stuff, like it's going to land with people.
He came to MIT last year. I can't remember the details except that he was studying fish, or like it wasn't just fish. There were like multiple collective, but it was a great talk. It was quite inspiring, even though he wasn't studying the brain per se.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's interesting because conferences do sometimes have these special slots that they offer to people who are outside of the normal range of speakers and attendees. And so like Cosyne does this. I think this is called the Gatsby Lecture. That's what he spoke at. And it is pretty cool, and it's kind of interesting to me to see maybe like how far outside you can push it and still have it be this kind of electric thing where people recognize that it's not exactly what they do, and so they're excited by that, but they also see the parallels to what they do. It's like this fine balance of getting something that's outside of the normal realm but still relevant enough, or at least still analogous enough to really be interesting.
So there's another conference called NIPS, or Neural Information Processing Systems, which is a machine learning conference, and they also do something similar where they at least occasionally or for certain kinds of such settings invite guests who are doing non-standard things or sort of interesting applications that maybe most of the people are less familiar with. They've had people who are, for example, like neuroscientists talk about their neuroscience research.
That shouldn't be outside.
But it is outside because it's like a machine learning conference, right? I mean,
there's I think people are conflicted about how much neuroscience should happen at NIPS. This is a historical debate.
Yes.
But okay, so they invite neuroscientists.
They have invited neuroscientists. This past year, they also, I mean, this is kind of machine learning, but they were inviting a person working on like stabilizing nuclear fusion using algorithms. So, I mean, there are times when you can learn about... conferences tend to have these kinds of stretch talks, which are maybe certainly outside of what most of the people there regularly think about. Maybe it's a little bit higher level, or like feels a little bit higher level. So like a neuroscience talk at a machine learning conference might feel inspirational to people who are
like, oh, we like got to reverse engineer the brain. The brain is doing cool stuff.
Or like it gives you ideas that are not exactly things that you would think about normally, and they might feel like they touch on questions that are relevant. So like in the case of a talk that's about an application like nuclear fusion or something like this, it might feel like oh, well, this is like a really important problem that the field that, we're all here because we're in can actually have something to say about. Or like in the case of neuroscientists, neuroscience at this case at Cosyne, right? It makes sense to me that neuroscientists are interested in social behavior or ethical dilemmas or things like this. And so the kind of stretch, like neuroscientists most of the time are thinking in their day-to-day about like, how does this very specific circuit work in a specific organism usually. And so the kind of high-level talks that will resonate and be inspirational with neuroscientists would be like, what is the social relevance of learning about individual animals and how they work? And so, in an engineering field, it would make sense that sort of stretch applications become the talks. Another conference that I'd recently been to for the first time was SIGGRAPH, which is on computer graphics. It's basically like the standard computer animation and computer graphics conference. And that's quite large conference, like, many thousands of people. And I was going because there's a sort of a very clear overlap with a certain niche that's there. So like, a smallish number of people, like 100 people there were doing something that was very relevant to my research. But while I was there, I learned about things that were quite far afield from things that I generally encountered in my research. And a lot of it is inspirational and allows you like appreciation for a greater contextualization of your research. I mean, it should almost be the case, obviously, that by the time you are doing a PhD in something, it's because you have as background knowledge for that a broader survey of many fields of science, which most people did get as undergrads. Or it's not that I like. Of course, I still keep up by like following what's going on in the mainstream kind of popular science press or whatever. But it's in some cases never been the case that you've heard high-end academic lectures on other fields.
That's true.
In addition to that, my ability to appreciate other fields has gone up since going in depth in a field. I think once you do a PhD in something, you're like, oh shit, the world is complicated. And every small thing that people figure out it was probably amazing that they figured it out. And so I can see in other fields, like I can come to appreciate the complexity and the challenge that it was in a way that when you're outside of it all, you're probably like, oh, whatever, they like found a molecule that did whatever. But if you come to appreciate how difficult science is, then it can make learning about things outside your field pretty fun and amazing.
Maybe especially if it's a closely related field, right? Because in a closely related field, it's like, oh, the methods they're using are like vaguely familiar, but like their goals are not exactly the kinds of goals that we have in our field. Like you can appreciate, like, I mean, for my purposes, like, the difference between doing sort of machine learning kind of research versus trying to develop things that are like useful for movies or video games, right? Like I'm not interested directly. I mean, I'm interested in like the general social sense, like, but I'm not interested directly in like things that work well for movies, or like for animation for movies or computer graphics for movies. But at the same time, like, something that I saw at SIGGRAPH that's very far outside like my world would be like, how people who do the computer graphics for Game of Thrones use physics-based simulators to like destroy boats and things like this. So like, what do they do? Like, there's a big, battle scene in Game of Thrones, which I've watched, and there's a bunch of like, wooden boats, like, in some sort of fight, and dragons breathe fire on boats. And like, that's all cool, and you watch it and you think like, oh, that's awesome. I mean, but at the same time, like, I hadn't really appreciated or understood how one would go about doing that. And it turns out like the way they do this is have physics engines where they simulate wooden boats, and then they like smash them with forces, and they have like particle simulations where like the wood shatters in a physically plausible way. And then they take that and they have like animators go and like paint over what has been done by the physics engine, essentially like using their animation software, like, but by hand basically.
Like to make it look cool.
To make it look
pretty
even cooler than they've got this like physics simulation at the base of this, but then they like draw over it to make it like a prettier animation than just like the mediocre renderer of the physics engine gives. So like I didn't even really appreciate how that all worked, but coming at it from like knowing much more science now and doing things that involve physics-based simulation, like it was an interesting, oh, they're doing things that in some ways like I kind of know how some of that works in quite a bit of detail, and now I can kind of
using it for something totally
different, exactly. And it's like, oh, that's like that's not only fascinating, it's also like weirdly informs how I think about the context for the work that I do, like relative to the context for other people's work. It kind of gives you like a slightly broader picture and tells you who your neighbors are in some sort of weird intellectual space.
Yeah, that's true. They're your neighbors with different goals, but they have I guess the expertise might be relevant. I never realized that explosions, simulating explosions was so hard.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Artistic and scientific at the same time.
It was interesting. I mean, SIGGRAPH was particularly weird for me because, like, I don't do anything that I think of as related to art. And at the same time, it's like, yeah, there's actually a strange amount of overlap that many people recognize. I mean, this is just me having not appreciated this between, like, doing physics and art. I mean, it's, kind of more in, like, the Leonardo da Vinci camp or something like that, right? Whereas I do more on like the sort of data analysis side of things most of the time, and machine learning intersecting with data analysis, which feels maybe quite different.
I think that hits on something that I felt kind of came up in some of the interviews as well, which is the idea that people get excited, like other scientists will get excited about somewhat closely related science in the same way that people who aren't scientists will get excited about it. Like the notion that neuroscience that relates to the understanding of human behavior or human disease or something like that. Like some of the interviews referenced the study of the sex of someone else, how the brain represents that information, or about delusions. And I feel like those are things that are just kind of generally interesting to the broad public. And it's also the case that other scientists will find that work interesting, probably, in a more informed way, and they may have more ideas about what it means about the brain and all of that. But I think it reflects that,
that we're human.
No, like, we should definitely all be interested in, like, the science of sex, the science of, like, I don't know, things that we all do, like food consumption, nutrition science, I'm sure, insofar as it's done well, interests most scientists as well as like the general population.
Yeah, and I feel like it's, for me, it kind of reminds you of why you got into a field, maybe, or, it just helps keep the excitement up. If you see other people kind of be excited on that level about your work, or you attend a conference and see that kind of work being done and you feel like you're part of that community and everything. I don't know, I think it's helpful even in that way, even if it's not so much about like the pure rigor of the science. It's just about the topic is intrinsically interesting to humans.
Yeah, I get excited about topics that are intrinsically interesting as well. And I agree that, it like kind of like brings you back to like, oh, why you got interested in the brain to begin with. So
have you heard any kind of topics outside your field lately that particularly excited you, Nancy?
Let me think about this. Well, this wasn't so lately. This wasn't so recent, but a couple years ago, maybe this was last year at SFN, this was like a new thing that I was trying. I'm like, I'm going to just go to a random symposium that I wouldn't attend.
I like that.
SFN has too many things. SFN is the biggest neuroscience conference.
So it's the Society for Neuroscience conference.
The Society for Neuroscience, yeah.
And like how many people show up for context?
It's like 30,000.
30,000 people, yeah. There's 30,000 people. So it's huge and it's pretty overwhelming. And I decided to just go to a random symposium, and there was one on brain-gut connection.
Oh.
And I just went, and it was fascinating. There was actually a talk about how the microbiome on the gut affected anxiety-like behavior, which at the time that was really relevant to my work, and it just blew my mind. It didn't change anything about my experiments, but then I just had this higher level of, wow, this is crazy. The periphery matters a lot, and it actually it almost sounds kind of like holistic type of research. It's like what you eat, affects your mood and whatnot. So that was probably the most mind-blowing random symposium. It made me aware that this world existed. And the other exciting, I didn't know this existed, was, and I think I talked about this in the social neuroscience episode, this whole literature of mostly people that study human social interactions. They record both brains simultaneously, and there's these cross-brain dynamics happening, and regardless of why they are happening, it was kind of like crazy to see that there's a whole field, and there's a big literature of papers that report this phenomenon.
Yeah, so this is cool. I mean, I think you're getting at another kind of related point. Like, this is like kind of another meta point, which is like, it's just useful to see what other fields exist, even. Like, where is it that, like, because it is definitely the case, right, that when you pick a field, like, there's no way, anytime you pick a problem you're going to work on, and this is true when you do an undergraduate major, and it's true when you pick a PhD, and it's true when you pick specific research problems, it's not like you're making an informed choice based on selecting amongst like a set of fields and every one of them. You
haven't been given like a buffet of like, here are all of the possible things clearly defined.
Yeah.
It's just you stumbled into stuff based on who's around you, and
because there are people, like, whatever school you're at will not have people doing every kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of this is like, what even other fields exist? And I guess another layer to this is, generally, most people do not get to go to conferences outside of their field ever, because it's expensive.
That's true.
And so when you go to conferences that are inside of your field, but like a little adjacent
and diverse,
yeah, you get to see more than you would see generally. And you just start, it broadens your awareness of, like, at a detailed level, what really exists in terms of other research.
Yeah, and I want to actually kind of bring up a potential paradox. with this kind of thing, which is, so Nancy brought up SFN, which is this huge conference, and it has a bunch of different sessions going on in parallel about very like particular topics. And so usually you kind of have to choose, like, okay, I'm going to go to this set of talks, and I'm going to go to this other room, and I'm going to see, these 3 posters out of the thousands that are possible. And you can actually go to this giant diverse conference and have a really like narrow experience where you only see things that are directly related to stuff you already know. And that's how some people do it. So SFN was the first conference that I ever went to, and I went as an undergrad, my last year of undergrad. And it actually is a big part of the reason why I didn't apply to PhD programs straight out of undergrad. I took a gap year because I was completely overwhelmed. And I thought, like, I had entered undergrad thinking, like, I want to do a PhD in neuroscience, and I majored in neuroscience. And then at the end of my senior year, I was like, oh shit, like, I don't know what school I want to apply to. I don't know what topic I want to study. And this conference has not helped. Like, now I feel like there's so much that I don't even know. And how could I possibly, like, get my head around this field enough to, like, do a PhD in it? And it was, like, so overwhelming that I applied to research internships for a year to, sort out my thoughts. So there's like a paradox in that the amount of diversity could actually be overwhelming and kind of shut you down, at least when you're like a young person trying to think about stuff. Or also you can just ignore it all if it's like very big and diverse and have a very narrow experience, which may be a good coping mechanism, but I didn't know to do that.
It also does seem like the coping mechanism that most conventionally successful people opt for, right? Many people who are successful within fields, I think, kind of shut out most of the diversity. They just kind of focus their attention and thoughts and consumption of research on the niche in which they are like most active.
I think that's true generally, but also particularly at conferences. I think like, the professors, I'm going to guess, go to the least amount of talks at a conference. Like they're there to talk to other people that they know and network and that kind of thing. But I feel like the more conferences you've gone to, the less like pressure you feel to take in everything that the conference has, because you've learned that that's not helpful for you. So even in a conference like Cosyne, which is small, it's a single track conference, so there's only one set of talks going on at a time, so you're either there or you're not, basically. Like people will still skip talks then just because they don't have the mental capacity to, sit there and listen to more talks, because it's like a full day of talks for several days in a row.
Yeah, I also agree that most professors or like, people at like higher stages, successful in their career, they do tend to only go to things that are highly relevant for them and use conferences mostly to talk to the people they know, because they think they're going to be the reviewers, like you're like in your own little world. It's a little sad. So the inspiring thing might not be what's most convenient for your career, which is to like really get to know the people in your immediate field, because those are like the people that are going to read your paper and probably review it.
So this kind of, sort of factioning, like forming smaller subcommunities within communities is something that I've always found kind of interesting when looking at the landscape of a given field. And one thing that like I've always had kind of a sense of, and it has always struck me as somewhat weird, is when there are like 2 factions doing like the exact same thing scientifically, but like using like slightly different language and mostly not overlapping.
Oh my God, I experienced that. Like, it's terrifying when you realize that there's a whole other sub-network of researchers doing something relevant, but they all cite each other. And so like within that, you can like not escape that little loop of citations. You could like look at all the papers that they all cite and never realize that there's a whole other group that's doing the same thing of having this little network of citations.
And like an example of where this happens within the fields that we're familiar with, like, I mean, there might be a clique in psychology where like there are hundreds of researchers all focused on a topic, and then there are a bunch of neuroscientists focused on the exact same topic.
That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah, and another one though, it's not just like that direction, like, which is obvious. I mean, there are other ones where it's like people doing, some kind of neuroscience, and then maybe there's like a clique in bioengineering or biomedical engineering doing the same kind of thing.
So these
happen in a few different areas, and I find it a weird phenomenon because, I mean, I guess it makes sense that it can happen, but I almost feel like the fact that it can persist is different than the fact that it can be initiated. It makes sense that there's like two people who start labs in very different areas and don't really cite each other because they just haven't stumbled upon each other's work. But it feels like as these networks get larger and you've got hundreds of researchers in each group, the fact that they form kind of closed off separate groups feels like there must be some sort of psychological mechanism at play where people like maybe people or junior people in these groups like stumble on the other group, but then they just like for career purposes or for like psychological convenience purposes don't engage with, like, don't cite the other group as much because that's not like the style of the papers that they see amongst the people who they work with.
Yeah, the idea that it could be sustained seems like pretty straightforward to me because of all the cultural things that go into what research you come across and what you cite. You know, like if you found someone in the other clique who did something like truly great, you know, then it would probably break through this. But if they're doing something that's like, you know, roughly average for your clique and their clique, and you bring it up to your PI or whatever, like it might just not go anywhere. Just like, oh, okay, yeah, but you know, we could also just cite this other paper that we're more familiar with that kind of makes a similar point or something like that. And the fact that the language used can be different can mean that it's actually hard to find the other research.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's interesting when there are like restructuring of these fields. I mean, I think this happens like neural networks for a while was something that neuroscientists didn't really cite. And when deep networks became a thing a few years ago, right, it definitely shook up the citation networks like this, these kind of cliques. People who were outside of the like neural networks clique needed to start citing that literature. And
the literature of
like
of
artificial
what?
neural
Of
networks, like the thing, like all the kind of convolutional neural networks that have that started this sort of trend. But it just sort of, I think when there's something undeniably awesome in one of these cliques,
yeah, that's when it breaks through.
It breaks through, but then the whole thing's like everything kind of restructures.
And more other cliques form.
And new cliques reform, but around different fault lines.
Yeah.
But that's reassuring that when something awesome happens, then there's restructuring. The problem would be like because of the clicks, they ignore the awesome thing. That would be really bad.
Yeah, there's probably things that are like just below really awesome that get ignored. That maybe it would be better if they didn't, you know. But the fact that things can break through when they're really good is helpful.
I think it's a more complicated thing. I mean, there are many kind of partial, quite, like, I don't think paradigm is the right way to think about it, but there are like many, like these sort of social networks where people are working on similar problems, thinking about them. It's not so much necessarily that they have an operating paradigm that they're using scientifically, so much as just like a kind of cultural milieu of people who they interact with.
Yeah, it's people. Yeah, I mean, I agree that part of the social structure of how academia works reinforces this, because if you think about how you get tenure by getting a big part of tenure is not just publishing. There's depending on the institution, you need up to 20 letters of recommendation written by senior people.
I don't even know 20 people. Like, period. Not even neuroscientists.
Well, it has conferences and, getting to know the cliques that are relevant to your work. So it's not, you wouldn't go to the other group because, they're not the people that have to write your letters. So part of the problem is how academia works. It kind of reinforces you to stay on your lane and to look up the pyramid within. Yeah, maybe. That's
and I'm also surprised by the impact of geography. Like, sometimes these cliques are, like, if you put them on a map, it'd be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I don't know if that's, like, people are traveling to universities nearby them and, they're more likely to give a talk there and then, like, a little network starts that way, or if there is some kind of cultural difference in how the science is done that actually makes the research slightly different, but...
Yeah, I mean, some of this definitely is, I think, explainable by, like, if you're in a certain region of the country for your PhD, you might want to live there afterwards, maybe. And so like geographic areas get populated by descendants of certain labs.
Yeah, that's true. This really is just like straight up evolutionary theory or something. I feel like it's becoming like very like basic, people migrated and then reproduced. So a question I will pose to you guys is, well, I guess Nancy kind of answered this already with the gut-brain thing, but have you ever kind of seen a talk or stumbled on something that you didn't think was going to be that related to your work, but then really impacted it?
So actually impacted the work, though.
Yeah, actually impacted the work. So I guess the gut-brain thing didn't for you.
Yeah, the brain gut talk just made me aware because it happened so that, anxiety-like behavior was changed by the microbiome in the gut. But let me see, one that actually impacted.
I would say, I don't know if things necessarily, I don't think the things necessarily have like an immediate impact on your research, but I think talks can have a more long-lasting, like if they inspire you or add new perspective, it might affect like the next project you select.
Yeah, that's
sort of
fair.
Indirectly. It's like,
yes.
Well, I'm working on something and I like what I'm working on and I don't really want to change it, and it takes me 4 more months to finish what I'm currently working on. But the next thing I do might be informed by something because you're usually maybe doing multiple projects at the same time, or at least thinking about multiple projects, or kind of mentally thinking of like a queue of, oh, here would be another cool idea. I'll come back to this in a few months when I have more bandwidth.
Yeah, I have like a messy text document of all my fragmented ideas of projects I could work on. That's where I put it if I see people talk.
And so, it gets into some sort of like noisy queue where you think like, okay, maybe I'll return to this idea. And I think it probably affects what you do next. Maybe the people who have faster turnaround, I think this is kind of like obvious, but you maybe if you work on projects that have shorter lifespans, either because they, experimental work, right, is going to be notoriously long timescale, right? You might have to plan an experiment far in advance and then do it for months. Whereas, if you do a computer simulation of something, you might be able to have turnaround that's faster. So it's presumably the case that like you see these effects, you see the effect of inspiration or perspective in a talk like more rapidly in fields that have shorter project lifetimes. That's kind of obvious. I don't really think that that's super insightful.
Yeah, I agree that it depends. That's true. I do remember being inspired by when I was at Columbia in grad school. David Anderson came to give a talk, and that definitely ignited me thinking about studying social behaviors afterwards. It wasn't the only thing, but that was the beginning. And that's what I'm attempting to do now. So yeah, but that was really long term. It's like we're talking like 3 years down the road, because that was the next time I could switch.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, obviously if it's a very big switch, you can implement it immediately. Though I did like a fairly sizable switch, but it was computational work, so it was easier. So I started using deep neural networks as a model of the visual system because a postdoc presented like an overview of advances in deep learning. Like this was shortly after there were big advances in computer vision with deep learning, and I was like, oh man, this is like the visual system, like it's working now, so I should pay attention to that. And then I started doing research on it. Obviously it's easier because I was like a young grad student and I was supposed to be deciding what I wanted to work on. So then
you were in an impressionable state.
Yes, precisely.
Was it a lab meeting?
I think it was technically a class lecture, but it was a class where people just presented papers.
What about you, Josh? Have you seen something that influenced your work?
I think my answer would be like, yes. Of course I've seen many things that influence my work, but like not, nothing's coming to mind. Like, I think it is this kind of ongoing, like I'm currently doing a project and I hear someone else think of something and it gets put into my queue. My sort of dumb and cop-out answer is like every project I've done is definitely influenced in like it was determined in response to like talks that I'd heard. Like I've never picked a project where I just thought like, hey, this is a project that I should do without any attachment to like any other, like it's like like every
yeah, you didn't invent like a field of research.
Yeah,
obviously. Right. So but yeah, I do feel like there are times it's interesting because you can get into the mode where you're trying to finish something and you will not attend a single thing that's outside of what's immediately relevant to you. Like, you can get so focused, like, honestly, to the point where, like, I'll only read a paper and I'll only go to a talk if I think there will be something that will turn into a citation in the paper that I'm writing. Like, this is the only thing that matters right now. And I think, but it's good to be able to have that flexibility where you can go into that mode, because that is kind of what's necessary to really get stuff done. You can't be in the high level, you know, I'm taking it all in space all the time and be getting stuff done. I don't think. Maybe some people can, and then they're better at science than me.
It doesn't work for me. This year, I might not even go to a conference. I've been going to conferences every year since I started grad school. And this year, I'm like, I just need to focus on getting these experiments to work well. So I won't even go to seminars downstairs unless they're like super relevant. I might be exaggerating too much, so I might have to find some balance, but that's where I am right now in this immediate moment.
Yeah, it's important to do that to yourself sometimes, because there are maybe like an infinite number of things that could be potentially relevant for your work, and it could be that like all of them would be fun to pursue if you had the time. And so you can really, I don't know, I get some anxiety sometimes if I see a paper come out and it's relevant to something I'm doing, because like, oh God, like I need to read all of that and like know how it relates to what I do. And so at some point, just practically speaking, you have to shut it down and just be like, you know what, I know enough, I've incorporated enough, it's time to move on. And to do that, you have to just tell yourself to not listen to stuff that's happening for a bit.
Yeah, just for a little bit.
Yeah, it is. I do feel like there are just phases. Like there's phases where I'm only doing things directly relevant to what I want to do. And then there's phases that I go through that are reading phases where I'll just spend like most of my time just catching up on stuff that I've bookmarked, when I was in my don't look at anything phase. I guess maybe last question, we'll start wrapping it up. But do you guys have any maybe tips or just descriptions of how you keep up with the literature? Do you subscribe to tables of contents? Do you, what do you do? Do you just wait for someone to come to your university and give a talk?
So lately, I'm relatively new to Twitter. Maybe I've had the account for a year, but I think that's the main place where I'm not going to say I read all the papers because there's so many papers that are tweeted, but that's where I might read the titles and abstracts and be like, oh, okay, this came out. There's that. I do get the emails of the table of contents of J of Neuroscience and Neuron. And sometimes that's how I found out about your paper, Grace, because I get the table of content. Yeah.
That's cool.
So
it is cool when you know people and you just stumble upon their papers.
It's totally
through normal dissemination means. It's like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah. It was so exciting to see a name I know. So that Twitter sometimes leads me to... depending on my state, is like, oh my God, too many papers are coming out. Or it's like, oh, cool, click.
Yeah.
And I read at least the abstract, yeah. And then my lab is pretty big, and we have a Slack, and people just throw papers there, and that's pretty useful. I go there, and there's usually something that I could read.
So I definitely think, like, within whatever kind of subgroup you're in, like, wherever you work, like, you'll hear about papers from the people who are saying, like, this is relevant, I know you're working on this, and they'll send it to you. And that, I think, can be a lot or a little depending on exactly your work environment. For me right now, that ends up being like an enormous number of papers. But also, I subscribe to keywords and things like this on like Google Scholar and Google Alerts have various ways where you can basically get notifications by author. Like you can pick certain people, and you can pick certain keywords that it'll send you digests for. So you can get like daily or weekly emails that give you all of the papers that have had this keyword in it or something like that, which can be kind of long, and you skim them. And I mean, and the thing that I didn't really, it makes sense, and it only started happening when I started writing papers, right? You can't do this until you've written papers. But when you've written papers on a few topics that interest you, you start getting, like, if you have, like, for example, a Google Scholar profile, you'll start you can get alerts for like everything that cites you, or even like networks, like anything that cites papers that you cited, basically, or like and this kind of stuff ends up being extremely. That's like, to me, that's like the most informative, because it's like, oh well, I've written like one paper on this topic, and then suddenly I can start getting fairly personalized feeling emails for like all of the stuff that is kind of related to that. And so I actually think the Google Scholar system does a pretty good job with that.
But the point is, like, publish stuff in an area that you want to know more about, and then you'll get these.
Yeah,
that's
not good advice. No, I'm not saying like that's not. It's not so much advice as it is like
it's a thing you found.
It's a thing I found, and I think it probably is the way many. I mean, I imagine once people are definitely in a field, like these kinds of means, like anyone you check out the titles of any paper that cites any of your papers, obviously. And for like people who are actually in fields, like that can end up being a very large number of things to check up on.
Yeah, I do the Google Scholar alerts for certain authors and keywords. I also have some tables of contents, subscriptions, and Twitter is a big one for sure. I also am, like, I'm on mailing lists for places that I'm not physically at anymore, and I just choose to stay on them to see the speakers who show up. Because, you know, the people that get invited to talk at research centers that do research you're interested in is obviously a good list of people. And then you also usually get like an abstract of what they're going to talk about, and it could be stuff that they haven't published yet. So that's a weird, informal way of seeing what people are up to.
That's pretty clever. Checking out the speakers who's getting invited.
Yeah,
I think that's a great. Yeah, actually, I also am on lists for places that I'm not currently at. That is quite informative.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any last thoughts?
I mean, I guess, and I think this is reflected in our discussion. Is it's like, you know, I think we all got into science because we find it exciting, and it's weird for there to be the most enthusiasm amongst us, maybe, when we're having a conversation about like stuff that isn't what we do. But I think that's just because we find that, like, while very exciting, and I was thinking about this, like, when we were studying this conversation, or what would be the difference between something you would want to work on and something you would find interesting? And I think that there's a huge gap, right? Like, I mentioned earlier, like the Game of Thrones computer graphics animation stuff. I have no desire to work in computer animation, but at the same time, I find it like extremely exciting to hear about. And I think that's because we're all people in the world, and there are many things that we encounter and we want to learn about. And I think that's just sort of curiosity and excitement. There are things that I am much more enthusiastic about actually spending my personal effort on. And I think that it's nice for there to be a distinction. You can be excited about hearing things or learning about things the same way you would about like seeing a cool play or going to see some live music or whatever. Like, you can just enjoy consuming science that is distant from what you're doing in an enthusiastic, you know, curiosity-driven way, but not have it even bleed through to things you would consider doing yourself. I mean, I would like to think, and I think it is true, I'm kind of more excited about the problems that I work on most of the time than the things that I hear going on in other fields. That doesn't really diminish either.
All right.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for having me, guys.
Thanks for joining us, Nancy.
Thanks.
Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.